Hello, and thank you for turning into Facebook Live to hear my story. My name is Bedian, and I'm the grandson of survivors of the Armenian Genocide. I too consider myself a genocide victim and a genocide survivor. But before I begin, I want to thank the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center for inviting me to speak today. I also want to take a moment to thank them for all the fantastic work they do, particularly in the area of genocide education and genocide awareness. It would be easy for a place called the Holocaust Museum to focus solely on the Holocaust. It's a very complex, multi-layered crime that reaches across decades and around the world. And there will never be enough time to present all the many aspects that make up the story of the Holocaust. Fortunately for us, the museum has opted for a more difficult, and I would say righteous path, to set aside some time and use its scarce resources and abundant prestige to draw attention to lesser-known genocides like the Armenian Genocide, to help us all learn some of the important and universal lessons that each one of these horrific episodes can teach us, to help us better understand the ever-present threat of genocide and the threat it poses to humanity, and hopefully to discover new ways to prevent it. We are all much richer for the incredible work that the museum does, and I thank them again. Before I begin with my own story, I think it would be helpful for me to provide some background about the Armenian Genocide to provide some context. The crime of genocide is based on identity, the identity victim. So for you to better understand the Armenian Genocide, I think I should first give you some information about who the Armenians are. Armenians are one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. Biblically, Armenians trace their origins back to Noah, whose ark landed in Armenia on Mount Ararat. Archaeologically, Armenia is home to some of the oldest artifacts of civilization, including the oldest winery and the oldest shoe, which is 5,500 years old. Linguistically, the Armenian language is a separate branch of the Indo-European language group, whose peers include ancient Greek and Sanskrit. Geographically, historic Armenia lies in the highland area between the Black, Caspian, and Mediterranean seas, and occupies about 150,000 square miles. Prior to the Armenian Genocide, there were over 3 million Armenians living in this area, split between the Russian and Ottoman empires. I want to quickly put up a slide so you can kind of see where Armenia was. And so Armenia, like I said, was split between the Russian and Ottoman empires. The green area is the area that were the indigenous homeland of the Armenians in Western Armenia, or what is now Eastern Turkey. And the orange areas were the areas that were predominantly Armenian in the Russian Empire. So in the 100 years prior to World War I, Ottoman Turkey lost many of its possessions as the Greeks, Arabs, Slavs, and others broke free of Turkish domination. The Ottoman Empire contracted, and a new ideology emerged whose goal was first to make the remaining portion of the Ottoman Empire more homogeneous to make it easier to govern. This was to be done by creating an ethnically Turkish and religiously Sunni Muslim state by ridding itself of troublesome minorities, both ethnic and religious. Once this was accomplished, a new Turkey could regain its position in the world, uniting all Turkic peoples of the East under a single state, led, of course, by Turkey. The first steps in this plan were implemented during World War I, when the Turkish nationalists leading the Ottoman Empire killed or forcibly deported the indigenous Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek populations. Over 2.5 million were murdered, some via horrific and brutal massacres, some by starvation, thirst, or exposure during death marches that lasted hundreds of miles during what would later be known as the Armenian Genocide. Okay, so as you can see, this is a map of the Annihilation centers and the routes of the death marches. It basically drove all of the Armenian population predominantly into the Syrian desert toward the black dot that's labeled Deir Zor. You may remember Deir Zor from a few years ago when it was one of the capitals and strongholds of Al-Qaeda and the ISIS movement. But as we see, 100 years prior, there were many massacres that were going on in that area, and all the Armenians that were taken from what is now Eastern Turkey were driven along the Euphrates River, the Tigris River, down into the deserts of Syria. Okay, even though Turkey lost the war, the killing and forced deportations continued into the 1920s. In the Ottoman Empire, over 65% of all the Armenians, more than 1.5 million men, women, and children were killed, and hundreds of thousands were displaced, many of them orphans. Numbers and statistics are important, of course, but they tend to dehumanize the loss, the terror, and the trauma of genocide. So that is why I think the museum's Coffee with a Survivor program is so important. These stories put a face and a name on the suffering and of the historic spirit of survival. So let me begin with my own family story. I'm a third generation Armenian American, the grandchild of Armenian Genocide survivors. All four of my grandparents were Armenian. All of them lost family members, their homes, and nearly all their possessions during the genocide. Although each of their experiences were different, they shared a common sense of displacement and loss along with their peers. My father's father, Asadur Bedian, grew up in a small village of Hunavil in the county of Divrik in the province of Sepastia, one of the 6 historically Armenian provinces of the Ottoman Empire. His village was populated entirely by Armenians. He was the son of Khachig and Sirpuhi Bedian. Asadur had a sister Maran and 2 brothers, Trepon and Shimavon. Although all my great-grandparents and their sons were successful farmers, they were barely able to eke out a living because of the heavy taxes levied by the government. Around this time, many young Armenians from rural areas sought work in foreign countries to help out their families financially, or to save up enough money themselves in order to go back home, find a girl, get married, and start a family. Many young men from my grandfather's village had already started down this path, including my grandfather's first cousins, 2 of which went to France and the other 2 came to the United States. So in 1911, my grandfather decided to leave his village and along with his father went to Bulgaria to find work. They stayed there for 2 years. And in 1913, my great-grandfather, Khachig, decided to return to his village of Khurnavil. In a move that would later save his life, my grandfather, instead of returning home, decided to go to America and seek his fortune. His first cousin, Harutun, was in Montana working for the railroad, and so my grandfather decided to join him. However, my grandfather took ill during the voyage to New York and was rejected when he arrived at Ellis Island. He continued on to Cuba, where, after he recovered, he was able to obtain identity papers from another Armenian and entered into the US under his name. Once he arrived, he linked up with his cousin Harutun, worked on a road gang, and then briefly worked in a copper mine in either Utah or Idaho. I have a little blue box around my grandfather and blown him up a little bit, but this is the work gang he was working in. And just from the faces and some of the clothes, I can see that there were other Armenians that were working in this work gang. This was a picture that was taken either in Montana or in Idaho around 1914. So after a few years, he settled in Granite City in southern Illinois, across the Mississippi from St. Louis, Missouri. Why he went to Granite City, no one in my family knows. But he found a job at Commonwealth Steel, which was a short walk from the neighborhood in which he lived and where many other Armenian migrant workers lived as well. And he eventually ended up working there for over 4 decades. My grandfather was in the US when the war started and the genocide occurred. For several years, he had no news about what happened to his family. The province of Sepastia was one of the hardest hit by the genocide. Unlike other areas, many Armenians were massacred on the spot and were not put into the death caravans. My grandfather later learned from his sister that when the Turkish death squads came to their village in June of 1915, they had taken my grandfather's 2 brothers and his father, Khachig, tied them together, and dragged them into a creek which ran by their house and shot them. The rest of the men in the village shared a similar fate, including my great-grandfather's 3 brothers, their sons, and my great-aunt Maran's husband. The only able-bodied men that survived were the ones that were out of the country doing migrant work, like my grandfather and his first cousins. The old men, women, children, including my great-grandmother, my great-aunt Maran and her 2 children, and my uncle Shimavon's wife and his children, were told to gather whatever they could and prepare to leave the village. We don't know if my grandfather's grandparents were alive and joined the caravans which left the village at that time. But what we do know is that of all the remaining villagers that were rounded up and marched on foot on the route of over 500 miles, most of them never made it to the destination, which was the Syrian desert. They did not have enough food or water and no shelter from the burning sun. Soldiers leading the caravan would beat them along the way, sometimes selling them food at exorbitantly high prices to get their hands on whatever valuables the Armenians had managed to keep and hide. Marauding gangs, organized by the government called chetes, would prey upon these caravans, inflicting terror, stealing valuables, raping women and children, kidnapping the prettier girls and women, and often killing for the sake of it. My great aunt Maran never spoke of the horrors she endured. She never talked about how her husband was killed or how her 2 children died. She never spoke of the horrible choices she needed to make to survive. What I do know is that of all my relatives in the village, only my great aunt Maran, my grandfather's sister, and her mother, my great grandmother Serpuhi, and a female relative named Nunya survived. All her 3 aunts, the wives of my great grandfather's brothers, and all of their children either died or were never heard from again. So going back to the annihilation roots, this is in green is Hurnaville, my grandfather's village, and this is the path my great aunt and my great grandmother took to Deir Zor, where the killing fields were. When the caravans arrived in the killing fields of Syria, my great grandmother and great aunt stuck together with a few others from their village and somehow managed to survive for 3 years until the war was over. If their survival was not miracle enough, they somehow made it back to their own village, covering another 500 plus miles on foot through lands that were lawless and dangerous after the war, returning to what was left of their homes. Sometime later, my grandfather received news, the first in over 5 years, that his mother and sister had survived, but the rest of his family had perished. My grandfather had sent them money to help out, and my great grandmother and great aunt slowly rebuilt their home and tried to rebuild their lives. Unfortunately, my grandmother and great aunt were forced to leave their village again, this time for good. In the mid-1920s, Mustafa Kemal, the nationalist leader who led the revolution that founded the Republic of Turkey, forced the few remaining Armenian genocide survivors out of their native villages in the Armenian highland and brought them to Constantinople so that Turks could be settled in these formerly Armenian villages. My family did not receive any compensation for their house or their lands. They were lucky enough to remain alive. My great aunt and grandmother remained in Constantinople, now remained Istanbul, until the late 1920s. My grandfather periodically sent money to his mother and sister, and by the late 1920s, he had saved up enough to pay for his sister to come to the United States. However, when she tried to come, she was denied entry in New York because of the immigration quotas. And so she went on to Cuba, where she waited 4 years to gain entry to the United States. My grandfather went to New York with a man from Granite City who was to marry my great aunt Maran. But when he had learned that she was previously married, he rejected her. My grandfather found another man who was from a village near his home village of Hurnaville to marry her, but he lived in Watervliet, New York, near Albany in upstate New York. A 3-day train ride from Granite City. So my great aunt married Magar Topyan and lived in Watervliet, New York for the rest of her life. My great aunt, who had come to the US to be with her brother, never forgave my grandfather because she had to live so far from him. And despite their best intentions, my grandfather was unable to bring his mother to the United States. She died while my great aunt was in Cuba. And I'd like to show you quickly a picture of my great aunt and her husband. So this is my great aunt on the left, Maran. That's her husband on the right, Magar Topyan. And that's my dad's first cousin, Bedros, or in English, Peter, in a family picture they took in 1936. The story of my paternal grandmother, Elizabeth, Asadur's wife, is just as tragic. She was born in the village of Yenishen in the province of Bursa, near the capital, Constantinople. She was about 10 years old when the death squads came to her village in August of 1915. Her mother, younger brother and older sister Nazanik, and younger sister Siranush were taken from their home and driven over 850 miles to the deserts of Deir Zor. Her mother died on the way. Suffering from thirst and starvation, the children did what they could to stay alive. Digging up roots, eating grass, and sometimes having to pick through animal dung to find bits of undigested grain and seeds. Her brother was separated from his sisters before they reached Deir Zor and was never heard from again. Family lore, perhaps wishful thinking, was that he somehow was able to make it to the independent Republic of Armenia that was founded in 1918. The 3 sisters proceeded on to Deir Zor, the final killing fields, and for those that survived the death march. There, my grandmother was separated from her 2 sisters and was taken by a local Muslim family to work as their servant. She never said much about her time as a servant and wasn't sure how long she was with them. One story she did tell us is that she learned to dance with knives to entertain them as well as sing. She never said how she was treated, and it wasn't clear if they took her in as an act of kindness to foster an orphan or whether they were just taking advantage of the situation to obtain a servant. This is the route that my grandmother took to, this was her village of Yenishen, just south of Constantinople. And this is the path that she took along with her sisters, her mother, and her brother to Derzor, again, to the killing fields. Regardless, after the Turks left Syria in November 1918, American and European missionaries, as well as the Near East Relief Organization, began collecting Armenian orphans who were taken by local villagers and placed them in orphanages. My grandmother was placed in an orphanage that was near Constantinople. So you might ask, how did she end up in the United States and come to marry my grandfather? As it happens, there was an Armenian woman in Granite City who was the wife of one of my grandfather's friends. She happened to have a friend or relative, I'm not quite sure, who happened to work in the orphanage where my grandmother was. At that time, when children turned 16, they would have to leave the orphanage. And in 1921, my grandmother turned 16. So when the woman at the orphanage wrote a letter to her friend in Granite City, asking if there were any Armenian bachelors who might be willing to marry one of these orphans to save them, my grandfather and another man said yes. I'm going to show you a picture that was sent to my grandfather. So this is my grandmother, Elizabeth Yeliazaryan, or Yaksapet Yeliazaryan, at age 16. This is the picture that my grandfather was sent to the girl that he was going to marry. So, like I said, my grandfather and his acquaintance agreed, and they sent money to the orphanage to cover the passage of two girls via steamship to New York. They came via Marseille, and my grandfather and his companion took a train to New York in September 1921, where they met the girls as they came off the boat. They took them to the Armenian church in Manhattan, got married, and took their new wives back on the train with them to Granite City. And here's a picture of the lovely couple. This is my grandfather Asadur and his new wife Yaksapet, or Elizabeth, as they were married in New York City on September 26, 1921. So during the next few years, my grandmother tried in vain to find her surviving family members. In those days, missing relatives were placed on lists that were published in the Armenian newspapers, especially those printed in the US, France, and in Egypt. As an orphan, my grandmother's name was probably appeared in the list published by the orphanage while she was there looking for relatives of the children. However, she was unable to locate her relatives, nor they her. As I said, my grandparents settled in Granite City, a small neighborhood called Lincoln Place, which was isolated from the rest of the city by railroad tracks and steel factories. Here there were quite a few Armenian migrant workers and their families. Most of them worked in the steel mills, although some had shops and one of them even had a tavern. All of them lost someone during the genocide. Some lost their entire families. How these people coped with the trauma and the loss they experienced, the difficulties of migrating to a foreign land without knowing the language or even the alphabet, going from a village life in rural Armenia to urban life in the US, raising families, surviving the Depression and then World War II, it's really difficult to fathom. One can only say that their struggle was heroic. When I was growing up, I used to spend a lot of time with my grandparents. My grandfather died when I was 11, and I never remember him speaking about his lost family members. I did not learn of many of the details of his life until I was given some old letters that my father had kept. These letters were from my great-grandmother, written to her son both before and after the genocide. Unfortunately, my grandmother, Yaksapet, had no such letters, and so I know much less about her. My grandfather and grandmother had 3 children. My father, Keram, his 2 sisters, Kerui and Serpuhi. They later adopted American names, as he would call them, Arthur, Carolyn, and Sue. Family lore has it that in 1957, when my sister was born, a baptismal announcement was placed in the Armenian newspaper printed in Boston, listing the names of my parents and the proud grandparents. Somehow, a copy of this newspaper made it to Beirut to an Armenian club where my grandmother's oldest sister, after spending many years in Syria, had settled after the genocide. Seeing my grandmother's name, my great aunt sent a letter to the newspaper asking if they could forward it to my grandmother. In the letter, she asked if she was that Yelisapet Yelyazaryan and stated that she was alive and that my grandmother's younger sister had also survived and was living in France. The sisters corresponded through the mail, exchanged photographs, and spoke a few times over the phone. They never got to see each other as none of them had enough money to afford international travel. And back then, only my grandmother had a phone. The other two sisters need to go to a local shop to speak on the phone. My grandmother and grandfather were married for 52 years before my grandfather passed away in 1973. Here's a picture of them from their 50th anniversary celebration in 1971. There's an interesting story about this picture. I was there in the room when it was taken, and I remember the situation very well. My Aunt Caroline was trying to convince my grandfather to put his arm around my grandmother. My grandfather didn't believe in displays of public affection, and so was very resistant. Finally, she was able to convince him to do so, and that was the picture that they took. I have to say that the whole mail order bride thing worked out for them, and it's interesting to see, that after all those years, without knowing each other, they were able to raise a family and develop a true affection for each other. Unfortunately, my family story is not unique. There are hundreds of thousands of Armenians who went through similar ordeals or worse. My mother's side of the family had a different story, but today I'm not going to be able to relate that because of time. I cannot imagine the horrors that my grandmother, great aunts, and great grandmothers experienced. The thirst and starvation, the beatings, the rapes, and other abuse they witnessed and experienced themselves. My grandparents rarely discussed their own personal experiences. It was just too painful, I suppose, or besides, they thought maybe what good would it do to pass on such sadness. Much of what I learned was from those few old letters that my grandfather kept, and from snippets of conversation overheard as children, and from things that I learned from my aunts and uncles. As a child, I remember times when my grandmother would sit and cry by herself. When I would ask her what was wrong, she would say nothing and smother me in a hug. From what I know now, I know she was continuing to grieve 50 years after the fact. When I began my talk, I mentioned that I too am a victim of genocide and a survivor of genocide. Although I did not experience it myself firsthand, unfortunately, the trauma of genocide spans generations. Genocide is a crime of identity, and I too have been robbed of important elements of my Armenian identity. Like the orphans of the genocide, there are things about my family I will never know, starting with their names. Where were they from? What did my great-grandfather do for a living? The traditions of my grandparents' families and of their small villages were also lost to me and my children. The unique foods, local dialects, village dances and songs will never be passed on. There were no family traditions, no long-standing customs celebrating holidays and life events. Except for those letters from my great-grandmother, I have nothing. No heirloom jewelry to pass down, no family Bibles to mark births, marriages, and deaths in, no photographs to hold dear. I also had no extended family, just remnants of what was once a family, broken into pieces, some in Lebanon, others in France, some in other parts of the United States. We had no family gatherings, no one to sit down and relate funny anecdotes or talk about the difficulties that they encountered during life. All of this was taken away from me and millions of other Armenians by genocide. But the most painful part for me is the ongoing genocide denial, ethnic cleansing, and anti-Armenian hatred, which has been underway for the last 100 years and which continues unabated today. I may not be a direct survivor of genocide committed in 1915, but I am a victim and a survivor of the ongoing one in 2021, with the Turkish government continuing its century-long drumbeat of hatred against Armenians today. Turkey runs a sophisticated crusade of genocide denial, using its military, diplomatic, and economic levers to force others to be complicit in the denial, unfortunately, including the governments of the United States and Israel. Turkey has actively destroyed thousands of Armenian architectural monuments, churches, and changed the names of towns, mountains, rivers, and even animal species to erase all signs of indigenous Armenian presence from Asia Minor, what is now the eastern part of present-day Turkey. As I said earlier, genocide is a crime based on identity. Those who commit genocide are not just trying to kill the people, they are trying to destroy a culture. As Elie Wiesel observed, first they kill the people, then they try to destroy the memory of these people. Because if these people never existed, then the crime of genocide could never have taken place. In Turkey today, anti-Armenian hate speech is widespread and accepted, promulgated at the highest levels of government. During the recent civil war in Syria, Turkish troops and their Islamist proxies purposely targeted Armenian villages, churches, and community centers in Syria, and even bombed the Armenian Genocide Memorial located in the killing fields of Deir Zor. They deliberately targeted the descendants of the people that they were unable to kill the first time around. If this weren't enough, Turkey's campaign of anti-Armenian hatred has been exported to neighboring Azerbaijan, another country with a Turkic population. As the Soviet Union began to collapse in the 1980s, Azerbaijan committed a series of pogroms against its Armenian population. In the areas of our indigenous Armenian population placed under Azeri administration under Stalin in the 1920s, Azerbaijanis began to attack and ethnically cleanse them. Although Armenians were mostly able to resist the efforts at the time, in 2020, last fall, Azerbaijan and Turkey launched a brutal attack, killing thousands, torturing and mutilating captured civilians and servicemen, and sometimes beheading them, posting videos of this brutality on the victims' social media accounts after gaining access from the captured person's cell phones. Those engaged in these crimes against humanity are praised, promoted, and set up as an example to be followed by the Azeri government. On multiple occasions, the leaders of Azerbaijan and Turkey have both threatened Armenia and Armenians that they had better learn from their past if they know what's good for them, clearly referencing the Armenian Genocide. Azerbaijan recently released a commemorative stamp for 2020, celebrating its victory, over COVID and the Armenians. And to kind of give you an impression of the things that are being said and going on in Azerbaijan. This is the cover of the stamp set. And you can see a person in a hazmat suit basically disinfecting or getting rid of the Armenian areas of Azerbaijan that were taken over during the war. Recently, the Azerbaijani president opened a large open-air war trophy museum, which included walkways displaying the helmets of Armenian soldiers that were killed during the war. Again, these could be considered the scalps of the Armenian soldiers that were killed. It's a very morbid thing, and it's unfortunate that this is the kind of approach and anti-Armenian hatred that continues to exist in Azerbaijan, even after the war. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, Azerbaijan's education system have imbued its children with a hatred of Armenians. Like Turkey, Azerbaijan has systematically destroyed thousands of Armenian monuments, archaeological sites, medieval churches, stone crosses, and ancient burial grounds, trying to eliminate any evidence of the area's indigenous Armenian population. These acts continue today. Most recently, as far as we could see, the Church of Lazanchesots in occupied Shushi, the top of the church was removed and replaced with a dome. But these acts of hatred have not been confined to both Turkey and Azerbaijan. Turkey has created an entire industry of genocide denial, paying millions to hordes of lobbyists, academics, and politicians who do their dirty work. Last year, Turkish hackers attacked Armenian-owned restaurants, businesses, and other institutions worldwide. Not only did they hack their websites, but they created bots to post false reviews on Yelp, TripAdvisor, and other review sites to drive away their business. Last fall, Turkish migrant workers in France marched through these Armenian neighborhoods, hunting Armenians during the COVID lockdown. And also last year, Armenian schools, churches, and especially genocide memorials were defaced with anti-Armenian graffiti, firebombed, and attacked, both here in the United States and in Europe. In the last year, there have also been physical attacks against the sizable Armenian community in Lebanon. So, as an Armenian, my history, my identity, and my people continue to be targeted and under siege. Throughout my life, the government of Turkey and its operatives have basically told me that my grandparents lied, that it was not my family, but tens of thousands of other Armenian families, that my family and tens of thousands of other Armenian families did not undergo the genocide. They tell me that yes, a few people died during World War I, but that happens during war. People die. They tell me that the Armenians decided en masse to suddenly abandon their homes and businesses, their belongings, and their family members for better economic opportunities elsewhere. They tell me that the hundreds of news reports about the massacres and deportations that were printed in the newspapers in the neutral United States and other countries were just Allied propaganda. And sometimes when they let their guard down, they will crassly admit that even if some Armenians were massacred, they deserved it. When you were a child and you were exposed to this kind of hatred, it has an effect on you. You wonder what you did that was so bad that people want to harm you. It's not until later, as a grown-up, that you can understand that you haven't done anything wrong. The responsibility lies with the leaders of Turkey and Azerbaijan for their systematic, pervasive hatred of Armenians that they continue to espouse, and the threat that hatred continues to pose. A threat that must be checked before more lives are lost, like those who died in 2020. And so I too am a victim of genocide, and a genocide survivor only because I have not yet succumbed. The active attempts to eliminate my people and my heritage continue unabated. I cannot continue this fight for the survival alone. The Armenian people cannot fight this fight alone. I look to you, the righteous, to be the upstanders. Those who will not look away when confronted with evil. Those who are willing to take a risk, to speak out and to act, and to oppose hatred, to save the lives of both the hated and the haters. When one person is lost, the joy they brought to their family and friends remains only a memory. The knowledge they acquired, the contributions that they could have made are all gone. When an entire culture is lost, their knowledge, the unique tastes and smells and sounds and movements, the literature, the paintings, the dance and architecture, and all other forms of creative expression are also lost to humanity. That is why genocide is a crime against humanity. It is a crime against all of us. And I thank you for taking the time to hear my family's story. I'll be happy to take any questions at this time.
Thank you so much. We do have a couple questions. The first is, how much of what you shared is, directly from your family versus how much did you have to fill in through research, and what was kind of the process like of learning the story?
Thank you. What I shared about my family was basically through research with my family and going through and stitching pieces of information here and there from some of those old letters and some notes and other things. I had visited my grandfather's first cousins in France in the 1980s and learned some information about their family story as well. The general background about what happened during the genocide in 1915, I'm very familiar with, just because I'm an Armenian and that's something I've been exposed to all my life. And the information toward the end regarding the campaign of genocide denial and the war that took place in 2020, I was actually in Armenia during the war in 2020. And so I witnessed a great deal of what happened in trying to help out with various humanitarian efforts. So it's a combination of personal information garnered from other family members who were still alive when I had a chance to speak with them, and then research that I've done through reading, through books. I've also previously served on the Illinois Genocide and Holocaust Commission. And so I've had quite a bit of experience teaching about the Armenian Genocide and the topic of genocide in general to high school and middle school students in the state of Illinois.
Brilliant. When did you start sharing the story, and why was it important to start doing so?
I started sharing the story of my family, of my grandmother, my grandmother, Yaksapet Yaryazaryan Bedian, actually in 2006. In 2005, there was legislation passed in the state of Illinois to make the teaching of other genocides beside the Holocaust part of the curriculum for Illinois schools. And at that time, I joined together with a few others and started working on preparing information for teachers to present information about the genocide. There was no curricula that was already pre-prepared, and teachers are already overloaded. And so we decided to put together information for them. And I offered as my time as a guest speaker, and we organized seminars for teachers about how to teach the genocide. And that's actually how we connected with the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center back in 2005 and 2006. We organized several of these workshops, and it became clear to me that the statistics and the numbers and the maps really didn't do justice to conveying and connecting with both the teachers and the students. And so I thought I would try to humanize it a bit more and talk about what actually happened in the microcosm of my grandmother's experience. And then I slowly expanded it to include my grandfather's family. And I've given other talks about on my mother's side, my grandparents and their experience during the genocide as well. So like I said, it's been something that really came about primarily as an initiative to help out teachers to be able to teach about the Armenian Genocide in public schools in the state of Illinois.
Amazing. Let's see. What do you want people to take away and kind of learn from hearing this?
I think there's a couple things. As I said in the beginning of my talk, this is a universal story. You know, in this case, it happened to the Armenians. In another case, it happened to the Jews or the Poles, the Rwandans, the Cambodians, the Sudanese. The list is unfortunately much, much too long. We need to understand that hatred is, in my view, the cause of this blemish on humanity. And we have to actively work to fight against hatred in order to prevent these kind of crimes from happening, in order to prevent people, humans, from becoming dehumanized and losing their value as people in the eyes of other people. And so at the high level, I think that's an important lesson that we all learn, that, you know, genocide can happen anywhere and be committed by anyone. There's no magic formula that, you know, oh, these people are bad and these people are good. It can happen at any time by anyone, and we need to be on guard for that. The other point I wanted to make is that the threat against the Armenians for genocide is very, very present right now, and it's been ever present for, you know, the last 100 years. The ideology that was created to create a homogeneous Turkish state and expand it to become an important empire or a resurgent empire is something that's still there, and that ideology preaches hatred of Armenians, not only Armenians, but of Assyrians and others, Kurds, that don't fit the ethnic and religious type that the Turks would like to have in their country. And so it's important for us to understand that this is a constant threat, and that countries that have built up large military resources can be a threat to their weaker neighbors. And certainly in this case, Armenia is definitely the weaker neighbor when compared to oil-rich Azerbaijan and, you know, Turkey, which has the second largest army in NATO. So the takeaways here are that, you know, genocide can happen anywhere. We have to be on guard for it, and we have to stop. You know, we have to try to prevent hatred, and we have to look for what's actually going on today and see if there are ways that we can stop hatred to prevent the genocides that are on the verge of happening right now.
Thank you. How can people learn more? Are there any resources that you might recommend for them to be better aware of the situation?
There are, you know, thank goodness for the internet. There are lots of places for information to find. I hate to say this, but you can start with Wikipedia, although Wikipedia isn't always the most accurate. It's often a good place to start to get a better understanding of what's going on before looking for other information and diving deeper. There's a lot of information out on YouTube. There's been a lot of presentations and discussions by various, you know, professors. But I have to caution you that out there on the internet, like I said during my talk, Turkey has a multi-million-dollar operation where they have bought academics, they have bought journalists, they have bought all kinds of people to prepare the storyline that the Armenian Genocide never happened. And there's different aspects of denial that they've chosen. Some people talk about that the crime doesn't fit the definition of genocide. Sometimes they say that there were no Nuremberg trials, therefore that there was no genocide that occurred. There's others that say that, people weren't killed, that it was an exaggeration, that more Muslims were killed than Armenians, because, and that, there were a lot of people that died during the war. So you have to be careful, just like anything else you're looking at on the internet. You have to look at the sources and understand, where the information is coming from. But another place to look is in the contemporary information that happened during the war, things that were not necessarily tainted. If you go back into the New York Times, or even some of the Chicago newspapers in the 1915, 1916, 17 timeframe, you'll see hundreds of stories about the Armenian Genocide. And we need to understand that at that time, the Armenian Genocide was, besides the war, one of the biggest stories that was in the news at the time. The American people collected, in today's terms, billions of dollars to provide relief to the Armenians and the Assyrians and the Greeks that were killed and displaced during the war. And that effort, led by Near East Relief, was the first international aid activity of the United States government. And so there's a lot of places you can look for that information. And if you'd like to reach out to me, I can also provide you with some information as well.
Thank you so much. That is all the questions I'm seeing right now, so I will let you close us out. Okay,
well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in. I'd like to, again, thank the Holocaust Museum for giving me the time to share my family's stories. You can join us here in 2 weeks on Wednesday, June 30th at 10 a.m. Central Time to hear Lucy Port, the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, share her father's story. Please keep an eye on the Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook and other social media accounts, where they will post a stream of content for the weeks ahead. Thank you for your support during all these extraordinary times that we faced during the pandemic. And once again, thank you for joining today.